Good morning. On behalf of Metro, I would like to welcome you, whether you are joining us in person, by phone, or virtually, to today's public engagement session for the Blue, Orange, Silver Capacity and Reliability Study, also known as the BOS Study. My name is LaToya Thomas, and I will be your moderator today. And again, welcome. We have a few folks in the room today, as well as quite a few folks online. For background, Metro is conducting this study to address identified longstanding issues and opportunities on the blue, orange, and silver lines, including capacity, reliability, equity, and long-term sustainability. After over 2 years of study, BOS Study team has identified 6 alternatives for improving the blue, orange, and silver lines. Metro now needs your help in selecting the best option for the region. Today's session is one of 3 public engagement events being hosted throughout DC, Maryland, and Virginia over the next several weeks, and is focused on understanding the 6 alternative scenarios analyzed by WMATA and its consultant partners at RHI. The goals of today's session are to share these alternatives and hear your input, both positive and negative, on the proposed scenarios. All of the feedback will be compiled after each session and reviewed in depth by the study team in order to recommend a locally preferred alternative, or LPA, to Metro's Board of Directors. Before I turn the meeting over to our presenters, I want to take a moment to walk through the logistics for today's meeting and the ground rules. We will have a 30-minute series of presentations from representatives of Metro and the lead consultant, HNTB, on the alternative scenarios before opening up for a 45-minute Q&A session at approximately 11 o'clock. I will give additional instructions before we begin Q&A, so everyone knows how best to participate. For our ground rules, we want to foster a space where anyone who has a comment or question can offer that feedback freely. To that end, let's remember the following. Participate openly and respectfully, and allow others to do so as well. Please save your questions for the Q&A period. We will provide detailed instructions for how to submit questions at that time. For in-person and phone participants, as we are managing several methods of receiving questions and comments simultaneously, please wait until you are called on before providing your question or feedback. For webinar participants, the chat box has been disabled, and you will use the Q&A box to provide questions and comments. And we will review all of these instructions again prior to the start of Q&A. Additionally, for phone participants, you will receive specific instructions prior to the start of Q&A on how to provide verbal comments. I will now turn the presentation over to Mark Phillips, Director of Regional Mobility Planning at Metro.
Thank you so much, LaToya, and thank all of you for choosing to spend a Saturday morning with us to talk about Metro's Blue, Orange, and Silver Corridor Capacity and Reliability Study. I am, as LaToya said, Mark Phillips, Director of Regional Mobility Planning at Metro. And if you've looked at the materials online, which I hope a lot of you got a chance to do, you know that we started this study in 2019, so it's been a while. So today we're going to walk through some slides that kind of walk you through what we've done in that time. We're going to talk about the purpose, the overview of the study, why we're doing it, what we've been doing. We're going to talk about the 6 alternatives that we have today, how we develop those alternatives, and then the next steps for the future. I mentioned that we started the study in 2019 to handle or address a series of pretty serious needs and opportunities on those 3 lines, as well as some of the region's goals for the future out to like 2040, 2045. So we looked at all these needs and opportunities, and the idea was to come out to the public and work with stakeholders, work with community residents, work with businesses and community-based organizations to kind of first come up with a bunch of different ideas and options for addressing those needs and opportunities, and then kind of walk it through a pretty thorough analytical process that looked at their costs and benefits, all of which was to try to give regional decision makers and Metro's Board of Directors the information that they need to pick a preferred alternative. It also aligns with Metro's recent strategic transformation plan, the Your Metro plan, that some of you might have been involved in or know about through public engagement. Just a quick word on that, we have now a new vision of being the region's preferred transportation option, the trusted way to move more people safely and sustainably. And to get there, we have 4 overarching large goals, as well as associated objectives for each goal. The type of project likely to be recommended by this study And the study itself, further 3 of those 4 goals that the region's agreed to, and completing the study, having this corridor strategy, is actually a initiative or program in the long-range plan, in the strategic transformation plan, called out as a priority initiative. So getting back to the actual study itself and what we've been doing, I mentioned we started in 2019. We did a lot of public engagement. We identified those needs and the opportunities and talked to our our partner organizations, community organizations, agreed on what those needs and opportunities were, and then turned them into goal statements. And after that, we came out to the community and talked about a lot of different ideas and concepts about how to achieve those goals, did some more analysis, and developed 6 alternatives. So to date, we've completed 2 rounds of public engagement, and this is our 3rd. We talked to a bunch of community organizations and stakeholders. We now have 6 alternatives and an analysis of their costs and benefits. So that's where we are today. The next step is to have more meetings like this, talk to more like elected officials, community organizations, and then go back to Metro's board of directors and ask them, support them in choosing that locally preferred alternative. And just a really quick word on what that means. It doesn't mean a project that Metro will build in 5 years, 10 years, next year. All it really says is that out of all these alternatives, this one is the one that Metro and the region want to do more planning on, want to do more analysis on, and yes, environmental review, and start building up money so that we can actually fund that project. Just a quick word on the purpose of today's meeting, which I think LaToya covered pretty well. We've got these 6 alternatives. We're going to show them to you. We're going to discuss the costs and benefits. And we have this online survey, as well as you here in the meeting, giving us comments about which of these alternatives you prefer and why, right? One thing I really like to point out, though, is that we are actually near the end of the study, so we're not revisiting the goal statements, we're not revisiting the needs and opportunities, or what the 6 alternatives are. So it's more about which one of these 6 do you like, do you prefer? So to get to kind of the more interesting ramp up in the narrative of how we actually got to these 6 alternatives, we had 3 major inputs. One was first identifying those needs and opportunities I mentioned, and those are things like Metro's systemic needs and our customer needs, like crowding and capacity, reliability, making sure the trains run on time, and building some flexibility and operational improvements into the system, but also trying to help the region meet some of its broader goals like equity, sustainability, and development. So we took all that, we did a lot of analysis. I mean, there's a lot of work and data analysis that underpins this study. But we also did a lot of public and stakeholder engagement. So if you combine all 3 of those things, they gave us the 6 alternatives that we're talking about today. That first need that I want to review really quickly with you is capacity. Now, admittedly, this study started in 2019, but I need to point out that regardless of what ridership is doing, we operate all 3 of these lines, as everyone in this room probably knows, and hopefully everyone online knows, we operate all 3 of these lines through one tunnel and set of tracks between Virginia and Maryland. That means that we can only run so many trains per hour on each set of tracks. Right now, we have a limit with our existing technology and the configuration of our system of 26 trains per hour in each direction. That 26 trains per hour has to be divided up equally between the 3 lines. So right now we can, operate 6 to 8 trains an hour depending on what our service plan is. But in the past, in 2017, when we operated 6-minute peak schedule, we weren't able to do 10 minutes in all 3 lines. That would be 30 trains an hour. So we actually had to scale back the service plan for the blue line to be only 5 trains an hour every 12 minutes so we could have that 26 trains per hour max. So that means that with the existing technology, with the existing configuration of the system, we can't operate all 3 lines at the same frequency at better than like 7.5, 8 minutes. However, all of our jurisdictional partners, the cities and counties that are around the 3 lines, are actually forecasting a lot of growth and development over the next 20, 25 years. So our jurisdictional partners, the land use agencies, really think that the areas about like 1 mile around these 3 lines are going to add 37% more people and 30% more jobs by 2040. That means our ridership is going to increase too, and we don't have that 26 trains per hour isn't enough to carry the riders that we believe we're going to have by 2040. So that's capacity and crowding. But we also have reliability constraints. Again, with operating all three of those lines on one tunnel instead of tracks, if something goes wrong, if there's a service disruption or maybe customers held doors for a long time, there's a fire or police activity, it impacts all three lines. Also, if we have a work zone, if we have a construction project, as you probably know, if it's on the blue line, it's going to affect the silver line, and that's also going to impact the orange line. In fact, because the blue line is also connected to or interlined with the yellow line in Virginia, if the disruption is severe enough, it can even impact yellow and green line service. So we really need to explore ways to kind of start decoupling or detripling these lines, and also just more ways to move around service disruptions and work zones more effectively and more efficiently. But in terms of reliability and flexibility, we also have an opportunity if we're going to start looking at the system as a whole, right? If we're going to look at a high level at this corridor, we also want to talk about resilience. So it's not just moving the trains in the existing corridor around, it's giving our customers more travel options, more path choices to get where they're going. We can explore that. We can look at alternative ways, alternative routes. We also want to look at connectivity and deal or address some of the historic difficulties in our system, like the Farragut stations. They're completely separated, but they're very close to each other. So maybe there's an opportunity to tie the Farragut North and Farragut West stations into one big Farragut station. Union Station has the Red Line, it's got MARC, it's got VRE, it's got a ton of buses and Greyhound. Maybe there's an opportunity here to serve that huge multimodal, that big regional transportation hub with another metro line. So those are the things we also want to think about. Those are all in terms of Metro's operational needs and our customer and ridership needs. But as I mentioned, the region also has a lot of ambitious goals to be an even better place to live, to be an even fairer and more equitable place to live. And we want to do what we can to help the region meet those goals. So in terms of development, we want to consider expanding high capacity, high frequency transit to more areas that our partners have targeted for development and growth. And we also want to support more transit-oriented development around the infrastructure and stations we already have. So we really want to maximize the use of the land around our existing transit and serve some of these development areas with better transit. And in terms of equity, this map that you can see here, all the orange spots are areas that our regional partners have deemed equity emphasis areas. That means there's a statistically higher percentage of people there who are low income or minority or some a different race or ethnicity. So it's an area that has, especially in the terms of infrastructure and services, a lot of these areas haven't had the same level of investment that other places have enjoyed in the region. So we want to look at opportunities to expand access to high capacity transit there and improve the services we already have in those equity areas, and maybe even include expanded access to jobs and economic opportunities and the travel time between them. And finally, the region, most of you may know this, but the region actually has very aggressive goals for air quality and reducing greenhouse gases. In fact, right now, I think it was about 2 years ago, the region adopted new targets for greenhouse gas reductions that are calling for a 50% reduction by 2030 and an 80% reduction by 2050. If the region's going to meet that goal, transit has to be a fundamental, key, core strategy. That means more of it and that it runs more often. Those are all the needs and opportunities that this study is looking at, that Metro's looking at, and that that kind of helped us shape the alternatives and the concepts that we brought out to the public. But the public input also helped us figure out go from ideation, like a broad universe of ideas, to these 6 alternatives. So, as I mentioned at the beginning of the study, or the beginning of the presentation, this is our 3rd round of public engagement. We had 2 prior rounds. The first one was building awareness of the study, letting people know what was going on and handing out information and getting their input on what they wanted to see in the corridor. That second round, in the winter of 2019, we came out, we were here, we went to a bunch of other places, and some of you might have actually participated in that. It was kind of a more hands-on workshop where we brought out big maps and we had data boards that talked about all the needs and opportunities we're trying to address, and actually let you draw on those maps, your ideas about how to meet these needs and opportunities, how to address them. And also, we had a survey and verbalizing your ideas. We collected a lot of input, and we had, at the end of that, about 275 different concepts or ideas to address these needs. So then we took all that information, we took all that feedback, we did that rigorous analysis I talked about, and we wound up with these 6 final alternatives. Now, this third round, as I mentioned, is to get your take, your input on those 6. All of that input, the needs and opportunities, the data analysis, and the public and stakeholder community outreach helped us move from just those high-level needs and opportunities to 4 concrete goals that this preferred alternative or this strategy, this corridor strategy for the Blue, Orange, and Silver Line should achieve. Goal number 1 is to provide sufficient capacity, rail capacity, to meet our projected future ridership needs. Goal number 2 is to improve reliability and our on-time performance in the corridor. Goal 3 is to give us some of the operational flexibility and resilience that I mentioned. And then goal 4 is to support the region in its sustainable development and climate change goals and equity, specifically access to opportunity. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Niles with HNTB to walk through the 6 alternatives.
Great, thank you. So we've put together kind of a wide variety of alternatives to consider as part of this corridor study. 6 different alternatives. They really fit into 3 basic categories that you see here on the screen. First, the no-build alternative. So that really looks at, can we meet the needs in the corridor with the projects that the region has already committed to build and fund over the next 15 or 20 years? Is that going to do the job? We also looked at a rail optimization and bus service option. So that looks at lower cost kinds of improvements, lower cost rather than building full-on rail lines in the corridor. And then we also looked at 4 different options for new metro rail lines in the corridor to address the needs. And they provide a lot higher level of benefits than the first 2 types, but at a lot higher cost as well. No-build alternative, so essentially that's the existing system as it is today, plus the rail modernization and a lot of the state of good repair projects that WMATA is continuing to do, so it includes those, as well as some projects that the local jurisdictions are committed to build and fund. That would be like completing the Purple Line project in Maryland, the light rail line around the periphery in Maryland. It would also include some of the bus rapid transit projects that the local jurisdictions are working on and have committed to fund as well. It would also include restoring some of the service levels, the more frequent service levels on the Orange and Silver Line in the corridor, bringing them back up to 6-minute service. But as Mark talked about earlier, the constraints in terms of the number of trains we can run through the Roslyn Tunnel mean that in order to do that, we'd have to cut back some service on the Blue Line to about every 12 minutes in the peak hour in order to accommodate that more frequent service on the Orange and the Silver. So that is also considered part of the no-build or the baseline alternative. The no-build alternative really doesn't meet the goals that Mark laid out for this corridor study. It would provide some benefit in terms of improving the reliability of the service, some of these modernization and state of good repair projects, as well as reducing the environmental impacts of the system, already pretty minimal environmental impacts, but further reducing those as well. So there are some benefits in the no-build, but it really doesn't address those 4 major goals that Mark had laid out for the corridor. Alternative 2 is the rail optimization and bus service option, sometimes referred to as lower capital cost option. So lower cost things we can do to help improve services in the corridor, short of building full-on new metro rail lines. So this would include some new bus rapid transit lines, as well as new commuter bus services in the corridor and in the region. It would also include looking at ways to make our rail vehicles handle higher levels of capacity and to see what we can do there in terms of reducing potential crowding in the future. It would also include making some infrastructure improvements in the area of West Falls Church and in the area of Stadium Armory so that we're able to better optimize the service levels across the corridor and better match them to demand. So these kinds of lower cost things that will address many of the types of goals that Mark laid out. And they can address those goals, but it does require that we develop services as part of this that are going to be attractive enough to get people to be willing to move from crowded rail services to some of these kinds of bus service improvements. It's also going to require a lot of commitment from local jurisdictions to make an alternative like this work. They would have to commit to putting in place the kinds of priority treatments on roadways, things like bus-only lanes and traffic signal priority for buses within their jurisdictions and on their street system in order to make this a viable and attractive option. This map here just kind of shows you some of the more specific elements of that lower cost option, some of the bus rapid transit lines that we've been talking about, some of the new commuter bus services in the corridor as well. Alternative 3 is the first in the series of 4 new Metro Rail line options that we've identified. So this alternative would separate the blue line out from the orange and silver lines at Roslyn. So it would include the construction of a new Roslyn station, Roslyn 2 station, that's probably about a block to the west of the existing Roslyn station. And it would include pedestrian tunnels to connect the new station to the existing one. So you can still provide transfers there between the 2 stations and all the lines. It would realign the blue line to serve that new Roslyn 2 station and extend it across the Potomac River in a tunnel under the Potomac River, a new tunnel that would provide a connection from Roslyn to Georgetown, and then turn to the east at Georgetown and make a fairly direct connection across to Union Station. It would include stations along the way, and the alignment would be probably generally in the vicinity of M Street Northwest. So there'd be opportunities to transfer from this new line to the red line at Farragut North and at Union Station, and transfer to the orange or to the yellow and green lines at the convention center as well. And all 4 of the alternatives, the rail alternatives that we've developed, include this common segment from a new Roslyn station over to Union Station. In this option, alternative 3, as we move east of Union Station, the new rail alignment would then turn to the northeast through the Ivy City area, up to the Port Towns area here in Prince George's County, and then over towards Hyattsville, up to College Park, and then to Greenbelt. This option, as all 4 new Metro Rail options, would address the goals that Mark had laid out earlier for the corridor. This particular option would do well in terms of minimizing construction cost of all the rail alternatives. It's the lowest cost of the rail alternatives. It also does the best in terms of improving on-time performance potentially in the corridor and reducing any corridor delays. Unfortunately, it doesn't do very well compared to the other alternatives in terms of attracting new riders to the service. This alignment runs very close and in parallel to many of the existing lines, which is a really good thing if you want to reduce crowding on those lines, which we do, but not as good in terms of attracting new riders to the system and new revenues to the system since it's so close in proximity. Alternative 4, similar to alternative 3, where it separates out the blue line from the orange and the silver line. And it would follow the same alignment from a new Roslyn 2 station over to Union Station. However, at Union Station, this alternative would then turn to the south and connect to some of the higher growth areas around Buzzards Point, Navy Yard, the St. Elizabeth's campus, and then down to National Harbor. And it would also include a connection across the Woodrow Wilson Bridge to tie into the existing Huntington Station, and essentially create like a blue line loop at the core of the system. This option performs very well in terms of, the best in terms of reducing crowding on the existing orange and silver lines, and it also does best at attracting new transit riders to the system and new revenues. It also is the best in terms of connecting major job centers along the corridor, and it's also the best at providing service to some of those equity emphasis areas that I think Mark talked about earlier in his presentation. So with providing new high capacity service, transit service to those areas as well. Bad side, it is the second most expensive option of all that we looked at. So it is pretty high cost as well. Alternative 5 is basically separating the Silver Line, providing its own separate service all the way throughout the Silver Line from end to end. So it would no longer be combined with the blue and the orange line. This gives us an opportunity to run express services in Northern Virginia, as well as a combination of express service and local service in Virginia. It includes a new tunnel that would connect from West Falls Church area for the Silver Line over to a new Roslyn 2 station, similar to the other alternatives. And then it would continue on with a connection across the Potomac River to Georgetown, over to Union Station, and in this case follow an alignment pretty similar to Alternative 3 with that connection to Port Towns and then up to Greenbelt. This alternative really performs the best in terms of providing or sort of maximizing the capacity we can provide in the corridor, right? So we've got a whole new line that's completely separated from any other line through the system. So that maximizes the number of trains we can run on that. We could provide a lot better than even 6-minute service on that line. So if that's something that's needed in the future, this option can provide 3-minute service or a couple of minute service on it at that point. It also performs well in terms of providing flexibility to take multiple paths on rail through a corridor. You don't always have to take one line or the other. If there's an issue on one line, this alternative gives you an option to take another line through the corridor that's maybe unimpeded by any implications on the blue and orange line, say, for example. So it gives you that flexibility and resiliency and that redundancy that you really want in a system that allows you to take multiple paths to get to your destination. The downside is this is a very expensive option. It is the most expensive of all the options that we looked at as part of this. And then finally, Alternative 6, that's basically separating out the Silver Line from the blue and orange at Roslyn, and then following an alignment similar to the other alternatives over to Union Station, but instead of going to the northeast, this one would extend pretty directly east to the Port Towns area and then to New Carrollton in Prince George's County. This option is best in terms of providing a more direct service from the core of the system out to the east, out in this direction. But it doesn't perform as well as the other options in terms of attracting new riders, because similar to Alternative 3, it also runs along areas that are already served by existing lines and parallel to that. Again, good for reducing congestion and on those lines and crowding, but not as good for attracting new riders. We spent some time looking at each of these 6 alternatives and preparing a pretty detailed cost-benefit analysis on each of them, and it looked at 14 different measures, and those 14 measures related back to the 4 goals that Mark had laid out earlier. So ways that we could measure their performance against achieving those goals. The results of that cost-benefit analysis are summarized here on this slide. If you just look at the positive impacts and the benefits provided by each of these alternatives, then the blue line to National Harbor Loop performs best, followed by the Silver Line Express option. If you factor in cost and you prioritize minimizing the cost, then the lower capital cost option, which is the rail optimization and bus option, that one comes out best, followed by the blue line to National Harbor option. And then down on the bottom, we've just kind of listed each of the options kind of in order, rank order of how they perform against the four goals. And you can see that the blue line option in National Harbor ranks first, followed by the Silver Line. We've also shown the ridership and the cost associated with each of those alternatives in that table as well. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mark, and he'll talk about a little bit about how we're going forward from this point.
Thank you, Mark. I promise we're almost done talking to you, and it's almost time for us to hear from you. I just want to close out with a couple of words on what the next steps look like. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, at the beginning of the meeting, that this whole effort, this whole third round of public engagement is aimed at showing you the alternatives, showing you the costs and benefits, and hearing from you. When we have all that information and we've completed that survey and gotten all the answers from the online survey, we're going to go back out to our stakeholder committees. We have about 6 of those. Talk to our community partners, talk to the jurisdictions, the cities and counties that represent you, as well as elected officials. And then when we have all of that input, all of that feedback, we're going to go back to our board of directors and support them in choosing that preferred alternative. As I mentioned at the beginning, that's actually kind of just the end of the beginning, the end of the first step, and it's a pretty long process. So that actually goes to this slide, where I'm certain, 100% certain, that people in this room, people on the online meeting, or anyone else who's looking at the study is probably asking, why now? We're still recovering from the pandemic. We're still coming out of COVID. Metro's ridership is still a lot lower than it was before the pandemic. Why are you talking about potential Metro rail extensions and maybe $30 billion projects? The answer is that any sort of project of the scope needed to address these needs, these opportunities, and our 4 goal statements is going to be a fairly expensive, high-ticket item. And that means that we're going to try to go for federal funding to support that, to pick up some of the costs. When you do that, the federal government has a lot of process requirements that you have to go through. You know, first you start off with a study like this, and then you have to do environmental review and what they call project development. And then when they think you've done a good job with that, they'll approve you getting into engineering and design. And then you go for the grant agreement. All this stuff at a project of this scale could easily take us 20 to 25 years, maybe a little bit less. It could be 10, could be 15. We're not exactly sure. But if we're looking at kind of the worst case scenario of 20 years, we're talking about needs that we really, even today with our lower ridership after the pandemic, we still believe we're going to need this project by 2040. Knowing that, since it's already 2023, we need to keep moving forward. And that's why we're out here to get the board of directors to support them in picking that preferred alternative, because there's a lot more work ahead for that type of project. We're going to keep monitoring our ridership. We're going to keep an eye on that. We're going to redo the ridership forecast during this next the next effort, right? So once we have this preferred alternative, it goes through environmental review. It goes through project development. During that phase, we're going to do the ridership forecast again. We're going to take stock of where we are and see if we still need the project. And fundamentally, I just want everyone in the room to know, this is, again, I just want to hammer down the point. It's not picking something to start building tomorrow. It's more of like a 20-year timeline. And there's no commitment on Metro or the federal government or our regional partners to build anything until we have the grant agreement. That's several years away. So with that, I want to thank you again for sharing your Saturday morning with us in the room, online. We have this online survey, so if you don't want to stick around and give us comments, if you prefer to get on with your Saturday, just please remember to go to the website at wamata.com/BOS Study. The online survey runs until September 30th, so you've got plenty of time to give us your feedback. With that, thank you, and I'm going to hand it back to LaToya.
All right, we're going to invite both the Marks to come back to the stage for our Q&A portion. So we'll have about 45 minutes for Q&A, and I'm going to walk through the instructions. We have a bit of a rotation for how we'll take questions to try to keep it orderly. If you are present in the room with me right now, you will see the option to use microphones. If you have the microphone, please raise your hand. Handsome gentleman in the back there has a mic for you. If you feel comfortable asking your question or providing a comment verbally. If you are in the room and you have, you don't want to use the mic, but you want to provide a question in written form, you should have received an index card and a pen when you arrived. If not, please feel free to go to the back table. You can get one there. Just raise your hand once you've written your question so we know to come collect it from you, and then we'll put that question in the queue. We will rotate through the room in order to hear as many questions and comments as we can, and some may be consolidated if we see repetition or common themes in the questions we receive. The order in which we'll do questions, and again, it'll be a rotation, will be as follows. We'll do in-person via microphone first, then in-person written comments, so via note card. Then we'll go to the webinar Q&A box, and then finally we'll go to the phone participants. So we'll do one from each of those categories and then cycle back through each time. Please keep all of your comments and questions respectful. Just a few other logistics. For in-person participants, you'll have 30 seconds to ask your question verbally. Again, please raise your hand to have a mic brought to you. If you want to provide a written question and you're here in the room with me, again, do so by writing your question on the card and simply raising your hand and someone will collect it from you. Webinar participants, you may use the Q&A box that's part of Zoom in order to provide your question. If you are on the phone, and I will repeat this for the phone participants, if you are on the phone, there are 2 codes you need to remember or write down somewhere. To raise your hand so that we know that you have a question by phone, please enter *9. That's *9 to raise your hand. When we call either your name or the last 4 digits of your phone number, we're going to ask you to unmute your line. And to do so, you're going to press *6, and then you will have 30 seconds to ask your question. So again, if you are joining us by phone, *9 to raise your hand and *6 to be prompted to unmute yourself. My final pieces of advice, step back, step up, step back, which is what we often say for folks who might be asking a few too many questions, make space for others to ask questions so we can hear from a wide mix of people that are joining us today. And then last but not least, written responses will be provided to all questions, whether or not we've had a chance to answer them or not, after this meeting, and they will be made available at Metro's website. All right, so with that, I'm going to switch to my iPad. Give me 1 second. Okay, so I want to open the floor for verbal comments. Hands are up in the back. Madhu, how about we start at the very back with the gentleman and the baby? Is our first verbal question.
Thank you. Baby steals the show. Well, I think this baby is going to be my age by the time you guys are done with this project. And my question is, with such a long timeline, and it feels a little bit like you're playing poker with local jurisdiction, who's going to deliver what kind of project, what kind of development, what kind of residence, high-rise developments. We know Prince George's County has a lot of opportunity, but we've had that opportunity since the Blue Line was built in 2013. I moved to the neighborhood because I wanted to be next to the metro, and I thought there's no way all these empty lots are going to sit for another decade, and they have been. And it's not to criticize the future Senator also Brooks, because she inherited it, or Angie Rogers' team, who's putting a sports field part of the transit-oriented development 30 minutes walk from the metro station, which means no one's going to ride on the Blue Line to go to that transit-oriented location. The question is, with what I'm seeing, how Prince George's County continues to surprise us on the development, and the Virginia and other jurisdictions, how much flexibility are you building into your alternatives to see whether we do that Blue Line corridor, whether we deliver those high-rise buildings, whether we're going to have those customers 5, 6, 10 years from now? What flexibility do you have between all those alternatives?
That is a very interesting question that may have many sub-answers, so I want to make sure I'm getting them right. The first is that any one of these alternatives, even if it's that lower cost, the rail optimization alternative, One of the things that we would do in conjunction with moving that project through the federal process is pair it with a TOD and economic development strategy for that project, for that corridor. We would partner with our jurisdictional partners, Prince George's County, Arlington, whoever it might be, right? To try as much as we can to have a proactive and aggressive approach to stoking new development, to catalyzing new development, but also hopefully to trying to tamp down gentrification so that we can have kind of a fairer, more equitable type of development happen in that corridor. That said, Metro is the transportation provider. We don't have land use authority. The only thing we ever have any land use authority over is our own property and development on our own property. So unfortunately, I have to set aside the question of like how Prince George's might grow and those policy choices. That's in their bailiwick. But I will say, I hope everyone in the room, if you're a Prince George's County resident, knows that they recently did a zoning change that has probably some of the most transit-oriented development friendly policy I've seen. So assuming the market demand can take place, the zoning's there, and we can get that type of development. The flexibility, okay, there we go. The flexibility of the plan, again, actually kind of stems from that long federal process, right? So if you kind of think about this LPA, this preferred alternative, being less of a defined, like we're going to build this and these stations will be exactly where we say they're going to be, it's more of identifying a corridor and a type of project. But remember, we still have to take this through environmental review and project development, and we're going to keep an eye on our ridership, and we're going to do our ridership forecasts again. It may be that like 3 to 5 years from now, that we'll say this is a good corridor, but maybe it'll be served by a different type of transit. Maybe it's not Metro Rail, maybe it's light rail, maybe it's BRT. Or the station locations are highly likely to move around a little bit as we go further into design and development. That's, again, when you have like 10, maybe 15 years of design, engineering, public engagement, environmental review, the stations you see on these maps are more general ideas, not specific locations. So things like that, that's the flexibility we're trying to bring into it.
And I would say that a project like this isn't built in one swoop, right? It's a phased project where there are pieces of it built at a time, and each piece really needs to have what they call independent utility, right? Where it solves problems and provides benefits, even if the rest of it never gets built. And maybe down the line there are changes to that or shortening of the project because things don't happen the way they might think they are at this point. So there's a lot of opportunity there to continue to shape the project as we see what happens in the future. We're planning it based on the best information we have right now in terms of what that future is going to be, but it might be a little different, and we have the ability to maybe adjust this project over time if that's the case.
I don't want to spend too much time answering one question, but I will say on that note, in addition to phasing, if it's a big capital project like that, like say the Silver Line Express, the Blue Line to National Harbor, that would definitely be done in phases. Regardless of what the alternative is, we would also look into developing over the next couple months an interim strategy. So like what changes can Metro make with our partners in the next 5 years to start addressing some of those changes, right? So like we don't have to wait for that full 20 years. We can do things like temporary, like BRT for the next 10 or 15 until that's the full development of that full project, that kind of thing.
All right, I'm going to go to our next question, which is written. If your hands are up, don't worry, we're coming back to all of you in a cycle. Our first written note card question. Out of all the alternatives shown, including specifically scenarios 3, 5, and 6 that include Northeast DC, why does only alternative 5 include Capitol Hill and Starburst? Why only include these expensive, useful connections in the highest overall cost alternative with Silver Line Express? Please talk a little more about the specific alignment area versus Union Market, Ivy City.
So if I recall, that's an interesting question. If I recall, keep in mind that over the last 3.5 years the study's been going on, we've also been talking to our partners, the counties and the cities, and their planning departments. So in conversations with DC's Office of Planning, they were interested in New York Avenue as a primary development corridor, but they also wanted us to look at Bladensburg. So we just wanted to have two different alignments in that area to kind of like show what the relative costs and benefits of those might be and to give optionality to that point about flexibility. So I just want to remind people, and Mark can give more technical answers about the specific alignments, but in addition to having two different alignments that we can analyze, remember what I just said about like the station locations being general and not specific. Like as an alternative moves forward, maybe it would be that part that's shown New York Avenue now, maybe that's Bladensburg in the future or vice versa. Like there's still time to work that stuff out.
Yeah, and I think with rail transit, metro rail kind of transit, you don't always have the flexibility to turn the thing on a dime, right? So you've got to have it sort of angling the right direction as it's approaching Union Station, right? And then as it goes on beyond Union Station, it can't make like a 90-degree turn. So sometimes we've looked at a couple of different ways in there to make that connection east of Union Station. And sometimes that means we're in a slightly different place out there in terms of what we're serving, whether that's down more towards the Starburst if we're going towards New Carrollton, or more up to the northeast, Ivy City, if we're going ultimately heading towards Greenbelt. But we wanted to look at a couple of options, and we included that in there. And there still may be some mixing and matching that can happen before we finalize this project. And based on the input from the district and others, that's going to help us do that. Sorry, I'm going on a bit.
All right, our next question is coming from the Zoom webinar. Alternatives 3 to 6 show either the blue or the silver line not providing service at Addison Road Station anymore, leaving only one line there. Does that mean there will be less service here?
Actually, it does not. So I want to point out none of the alternatives actually change the capacity for rail service on the Blue Line corridor. I know I'm glad somebody asked that because Prince George's has made the Blue Line corridor like one of their primary economic development strategies. It's a huge land use possibility, like a lot of potential. So that 26 trains per hour we have today on the Blue Line corridor will still be there with any of these alternatives. It's just that it might be, maybe the Blue Line loop is like the pink line and the Blue Line still comes to Largo, or there's a taupe line that serves Largo. Yeah. The capacity will still be there. The actual, which line it is and how that looks, that would be a future decision. But none of these alternatives reduce the rail capacity on this branch.
Yeah, and by pulling out the blue or pulling out the silver on its own, you have the ability to leave the line that's left with a lot more frequent service, right? So that level of service would increase on the existing lines that remain after you pull one or the other of those lines out.
All right, I'm going to take our next verbal question. Young lady in the back.
So what I want to say was that for the really for alternative, the Blue Line loop alternative, considering that a lot of the line is just the blue line, but the blue line still has that section it shares with the yellow line. Yeah. That's going to impact service on that new core tunnel through downtown. So will there be is there like an opportunity there for like an additional short turning service that might run, say, between like Roslyn and the National Harbor via downtown DC?
That's an interesting idea. That stretch of the Blue Line loop is a little bit of a conundrum for us because we want to maintain the same level of service in National Landing, like Crystal City, Pentagon. Right now, those are all served by both the blue and yellow lines. So if we took the blue completely out and you only had yellow, the yellow goes over the 14th Street Bridge and it's interlined with the green. So we had that same capacity constraint on the green and yellow, right? Like we could never run 26 trains per hour on the yellow line because it also joins with the green. So we're trying not to reduce the rail capacity in Northern Virginia in that National Landing area, but if we completely separated the Blue Line loop, we could have that full 26 train per hour capacity there. So that's an interesting iteration that we can look at. If you provide a written comment or just maybe leave something with the team so that we can remember to look into that. But it would require, doing short turns like that would require more infrastructure as well. So even if the Blue Line loop wasn't built, we would need some sort of pocket track, like north of Arlington Cemetery, or like a Roslyn 2 new platform or something. But
and that issue is what makes alternative 5, right? The Silver Line Express, such an attractive option because there you've completely separated the Silver from every other line and given it this new alignment and connection, so you're not constrained by it having to be interlined somewhere else with another line.
All right, from our written note cards, I'm most in favor of the Blue Line loop to National Harbor, but how possible is it for the Greenbelt to Union Market part to someday exist as its own line? Can we have both worlds?
Anything's possible with sufficient resources and political will. Yeah, there's no reason we couldn't build 2 of these alternatives. We would just, the ridership demand would need to be there, the political will with the region would need to be there, and the financial resources would need to be there. And when I say financial resources, I also mean the federal government. It's highly doubtful that our local partners would want to foot the bill for any of these completely on their own.
All right. Our next question is from the Zoom webinar. If this is 20 years from now, why aren't we doing more than one project? Also, I live in southern Prince George's County, Forestville area. The only option that comes close to serving my area is the National Harbor one, which is still far from me.
I think that answer is relatively close to the one we just gave. There's a lot of need. There's a lot of need and opportunity in this region for more transit and better transit. You probably know we're doing the Better Bus Network redesign to try to completely rework that. We're looking at this. There's also the potential, I think in the future we need a system-wide long-range plan that's not just about the Blue, Orange, and Silver corridor, but the entire system. That said, kind of related to the question I just answered, resource constraints. Yeah, I mean, we can look at additional lines, we can look at additional strategies, but we would need the funding to do it, as well as the political support from elected officials and our jurisdictional partners.
Okay, interim question. Gentlemen, blue polo shirt, you've had your hand up for a little while in the last row. Yep.
Right. Yeah, do the estimated ridership changes take into account the level to which decreased service delays would lead to increased ridership? And if so, what of those factors were considered? Additionally, studies have shown that transit riders overestimate time waiting for a vehicle by 32% more than while they're on the vehicle. So was that taken into account for these alternatives that may involve additional transfers to get to the same destinations that people are currently going to?
So I will say that all of our ridership forecasts, just like any major transportation project in the region, was done with the regional travel demand model that our Council of Governments, our MPO, develops. So I know that travel time and reliability are factors in the model. I am not a modeler, so I'm not going to pretend. I'm not going to, accidentally lie to you and tell you I know exactly how that works.
Those models are calibrated against existing conditions, so they do take into account things like delay and disruption as part of that. And it's just assumed that in the future it would be similar to the way it is today. So if there are improvements that we make that reduce that, maybe it would be you'd result in a little more ridership than might be the case. But we use the best tools we've got now based on the existing system and how that works.
But the point about transfers is a good one, and the perception of wait time is very real. I will say, though, that because every one of these alternatives increases the capacity in the corridor, we could actually run more service, the wait times would fall. Even if somebody has a transfer, right, the train's going to come more often. So it's a balance between the two. Like what exactly that transfer time and the wait time would be, I'm not sure yet, because that's a future condition. But it's that balance between more service versus an additional transfer.
From our written note cards, again, we're coming back around for the folks who are in the room. In looking at Alternative 4, I wondered if the National Harbor Plan was developed with the potential relocation of Washington's football team to Oxon Cove in mind.
Not specifically. We did do it, we had several land use inputs. We had the regional forecast that all the cities and counties do together, and that's kind of done through the Council of Governments as well. So all the growth, development, population, and job changes over the next 20, 25 years is in that data that we used. So if they assumed the relocation of the Washington sports team, it would be in there. I don't think they did, but we also interacted with all of our jurisdictional partners in terms of their land use plans and their zoning and what that development opportunities were. But like a specific project like that that came up during, like recently, no, I'll be honest, it's not included.
From Zoom, will the proposed new stations and any of the alternatives include platform screen doors? If not, they really should be included as they are an important safety feature of any modern transit system.
So, we had not factored platform doors into the cost for this project or the assumption for our capital needs, but I know that's something that our new general manager is very interested in and is exploring the potential, I just want to say potential, of deploying those system-wide. So if that becomes Metropolitan, if that's built into our capital plan, then it would apply to this project as well. But we didn't specifically assume platform doors for this.
All right, in person in the room questions. Straw hat right here in the middle section.
Yeah, thanks. My name's Dave Owens. I represent an organization called Fort Washington Forward in Southern Maryland. And I hear a lot of conversation about needing funding and ridership delays. And it keeps me going back to this idea of Metro needs more riders. And I couldn't help but think that, considering that, and this is just a comment, alternative 4, National Harbor, has got to be the number one option. It just seems like it because it adds more ridership to an organization that desperately needs new riders. I mean, all this stuff about platforms and ridership delays, that's just a money thing. And when I think about Southern Prince George's County, I think about Fort Washington, Clinton, Brandywine, Waldorf, people who are trapped in their cars and have no Metro access, people who make a lot of money, who could be on Metros, which is desperately what Metro needs. And so, you know, someone asked the question earlier about why now. I hope that as this gets pitched, we don't fall into this idea of cost. Everything costs. You guys need riders. You need money. Alternative 4 is it's a no, I won't say a no-brainer, but it's got to be the way to go here. It's got to be. That's what I would say.
I appreciate that. Yeah, and you are right about us needing writers. Did you, by the way, did you happen to take the survey?
I'm going to take the survey.
From Zoom, what are the stakeholder committees? Who are the people currently involved in those committees, and how can new members be involved or engage with those groups?
So we have 6. 2 of them are actually like internal Metro committees of technical experts and management. The other 4 are, there's 2 of our jurisdictional partners. So departments of transportation, regional transportation planners, land use planners. We've invited all the representatives from the jurisdictions that Metro serves to serve on a leadership committee and a technical committee. Then we have a stakeholder committee for community-based organizations and business interests like business improvement districts, bids. We have CBOs. We have a full list of the stakeholders that are included on that on the website if you want to look into it. And then finally, we have the elected officials as kind of an executive committee. If you're interested, if you represent or a member of a CBO, absolutely feel free to contact me and we will put you in touch on that committee. CBO is a community-based organization. So if you're representing an organization that represents constituencies, if you represent low-income folk, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, those kind of people, we bring them in. And riders, yeah, we do have ridership advocacy organizations, absolutely. Most of the public input that we're getting from like individual people is through the public meetings like this, not necessarily a stakeholder committee. Those are more for organizations.
Okay, let me take another hand-raised comment. Gentleman with a white T-shirt.
Thank you. With Metro facing a potential $750 million shortfall in their budget this upcoming, what additional, I guess, funding commitments will you guys need from your regional partners to ensure that a big capital project like this is fully funded. And like I said, I know you talked about it being phased, but that it's fully realized.
That is a huge elephant in the room, and I'm not going to pretend it's not here. It's very real. I cannot speak for our executive leadership or for our regional partners in terms of what the possibilities are for closing that funding gap. That's, to be fair, that's well above my pay grade, and I really can't speak for the general manager or our board of directors. I know those conversations are happening. They're happening every day, and they're going to keep happening, hopefully until that funding gap is closed. I will say, if the region can't figure out an agreement, something like this would never move forward. There's no way we can go forward with a $20, $30 billion project and still have a $750 million funding gap. In terms of funding commitments for this project, let's say that does happen, fingers crossed, and we actually have the resources we need. We would actually need, again, with that federal process, it requires you to have, I think it's like 30% of your local funding commitment for the construction costs by the time you get into engineering and design. So we would have to go through project development and environmental review, but to get federal approval to start that engineering process, like to get their approval to do it, 30% of the local funding has to be committed in like our jurisdictional partners' budgets. So that's the kind of funding commitment we would need.
From Zoom, I read a blog with a proposal to create a pink line that would modify the blue loop alternative to allow full optimization of the new line's capacity. Have you considered this idea?
That's similar to the other question we had, or the answer about service in Crystal City, what they're calling national landing in Virginia. I find the idea of a blue line loop that's completely separated interesting. I think that's the best way to maximize capacity. But again, we can't really do that without decreasing service in national landing, so we have to be really careful about that interplay. But it is something we can continue to look at during project development and environmental review. I just want to remind people that because the yellow line is interlined, they share, the yellow line and the green line share the same tunnel instead of tracks in DC, and we have a lot of ridership and growth on the green line. We don't want to artificially constrain that by taking service out of that Arlington corridor. So it's complicated.
I'm going to come back to the room. Gentleman here in the front in the royal blue. Oh, the mic is coming to you right now.
Okay, great. Hello. Sort of a multi-pronged question. While it overlaps with capacity and new riders, the extent to which the study took into consideration which alignment would best address evening out the reverse commute, and it's a combination of sort of a WMATA issue, but also a equity and economic growth issue as well. So that's one prong. The sort of other part is in looking at the blue line loop, which I agree with many of the comments that the gentleman to my right just made. I know when you briefed the council, which was about a year and a half ago or so, they seem to like the blue line loop, but they also threw out the idea of perhaps connecting it, having a stop in National Harbor and maybe connecting it to the green line at either Branch or Suitland. Did you study that as part of the effort over the last year and a half or so? And then lastly, if you can just, and if you touched on it, forgive me, but the sort of process for getting to the locally preferred alternative, and is there a comments period now, and how long is that?
Thank you. I'm going to try to remember all three questions, respond as quickly as I can, because I know there's more. I'm going to go last to first. So the last, about the public comment process, that's what we're in now. So we're running the survey online until September 30th, and we're doing these public meetings. So you can give us comments here today, you can email the project address, or you can take the survey until September 30th. That's not, technically that's the last comment period for this study, right? To get, before we go to our board of directors and ask them to choose that locally preferred alternative. I will note, you might remember I talked about like some of the next steps. is going back to our stakeholder committees and then also going to elected officials. So I would say if you feel very strongly about any of these, also tell your elected officials, because we'll be going to them next. And then we'll be including their feedback and their responses when we go to our board. So that process, we don't have a timeline on this yet, but it's basically finish the public meetings, stakeholder and elected officials, and then our board of directors picking the LPA. So that's the process. Question number 2, I believe it was, about a National Harbor branch going to Branch Avenue or Suitland. We didn't specifically look at that in this study, but that would be what I would consider kind of an iteration on the preferred alternative that we could explore during environmental review and project development. I believe the first question, can you repeat the first question? There we go. We didn't actually specifically look at the reverse commutes, although it is super important now, especially like post-COVID. We're finding out that like all-day service and weekend service for us is just as important as the old peak, like 9 to 5 ever was. So again, when we do project development and environmental review, we're going to redo the ridership forecast. But I do think, and this is going to be the end of this answer, all-day service and reverse commutes are best served by putting transit in high-demand areas and like natural corridors of activity, right? Where a lot of people live and a lot of people work. If you do that, then the reverse commutes will be there. Especially if downtown DC can build housing, you're going to get a lot more people looking for jobs other places or just going other places for fun and activities and nightlife. So that's the best way, I think, is targeting natural corridors instead of like, low-scale suburban areas necessarily.
From Zoom, if I'm understanding this correctly, equity is part of the transportation objective. If so, why are we proposing service to already existing lines when the extension of the Blue Line to National Harbor will provide service to a huge underserved area as it pertains to public transit? This option has the highest in ridership and serves the entire southern Maryland suburb, most of whom commute to DC and Northern Virginia for work and currently have very limited public transit options.
Yeah, so that's, I think the equity argument is one of the primary reasons that the Blue Line Loop emerged as an alternative. If you remember, we have 4 goals: development and equity, also capacity and reliability, right? So we looked at the map, we looked at all the planned growth, and we looked at the equity emphasis areas, and that was a primary driver in the alignment of the Blue Line Loop, but it was also a driver in the alternatives that go to like the Hyattsville area and College Park and port towns. Like that's why that alignment exists as well, that plus development opportunities. But just keep in mind, and then I'm either going to pass it to Mark or a different question, we also have to balance the equity and development goals against the capacity and reliability goals. So if you look at, part of the question was why are you serving so many places already served? Again, we looked at where most of the ridership and most of the crowding was on the blue, orange, and silver lines, and you've got to try to have an option that serves those same travel patterns or something close to it, or people will just keep using the same lines and having the same crowding. So that's why there's a lot of parallel parts of this.
Yeah, and that was when I was explaining as we were going through the alternatives, it's a little bit of a balance of having one that's parallel and in close proximity. It's good for some things, like reducing crowding, but doesn't provide new riders. We're trying to find a balance that gets us all of those things, and that's why things like the Blue Line Loop emerged.
I'm going to come back to the room. Last row, blue polo.
Hey, thanks for doing this. A question and then a comment. So I think, Mark Phillips, you mentioned the possibility of an interim strategy for the next 5-10 years. I would just really put an emphasis on that. I think there's a lot of need that needs to be addressed right now with respect to, for example, bus lines. And I'm curious if there's going to be a similar process for bus lines and addressing sort of access to bus lines and frequency of buses in the next 5 years. So that's my question. My comment is echoing the comment the gentleman made earlier about the benefits to Prince George's County and southeast of the Blue Loop. And I would also just emphasize that I think a lot of the roads in Prince George's County are already at capacity. They were never meant to carry the number of cars that they're carrying right now. And I think to the extent that your study is considering the possibility of various metro stations being hubs for bus lines in that area, I think there would be a lot of benefit to the county that should be emphasized as we think about the various alternatives, not just from the metro lines themselves, but from their service as hubs for bus lines out to the broader community?
Thanks for that. So on for the question part, I hope everybody in the room knows about the Better Bus Network redesign that's going on right now. So if you do, you know that they're looking at, and part of my team is actually engaged on that project as well. The whole idea is to look at where all the opportunity and the need really is and try to like completely reshape the historic aggregation of buses in this area and in DC and in Virginia and make it work better for our customers. So hopefully over the next several years, you'll see a better bus network that can address some of these needs you're talking about. Specifically for our interim strategy, I'm not quite sure what it's going to be yet because we're going to develop that over the next couple of months. But whatever it is, we will do more public engagement on that during environmental, like whether the, let me step back a second. When we do the project development and environmental review phases of the LPA, we're going to do public engagement again. So that public engagement will be both about the entire LPA as well as the interim strategy. So that's where we can get specific comments focused on like whatever bus strategies, whatever it might be.
I'm going to go to a written note card question. Alternative 4 absolutely answers the equity question. Ward 8 of DC, where I teach, and Oxon Hill and Forest Heights have probably the most underserved and economically challenged, yet dense populations in the region. Should another alternative be chosen, and is there a backup plan for this stretch?
I frankly don't know how to answer that. If the LPA ends up not being alternative 4, I think we can work with our jurisdictional partners and in DC and Prince George's to look at if there's something else we can do during that interim, that short-term strategy. Or if we, again, Metro, I think there's a need for Metro to have a system-wide long-range plan that's not particularly focused on the Blue, Orange, and Silver corridor. So maybe that's an opportunity as well. But without our jurisdictional partners, we're not, I can't guarantee that we would have an option that would serve those areas if the Blue Line Loop is not the LPA.
From Zoom, in favor for the Blue Line to National Harbor, but why now? Why was this not something to consider when National Harbor was in development? As mentioned, the line would travel via the Woodrow Wilson Bridge. How would this work?
So I can't really speak to why it wasn't done in the past. I will note that the Wilson Bridge development, though, it always assumed or held space for high capacity transit. So that's there. That space is there, and they're holding it for us. In terms of how it would work, it's a little complicated because it is a drawbridge, right? I've been assured by our engineers that we have the technology, that the tracks and the power wouldn't be interrupted. Like it does exist where the drawbridge can go up, come back down, and everything still works fine. Operationally, the drawbridge, I've been told, only actually ever goes up about 64 times in a whole year. So it's not a huge impact, but when it does raise, we would have a delay.
Yeah, it's like a little more than once a week, perhaps.
And just as a footnote, the 11th and 12th lanes were constructed specifically to accommodate and be able to handle heavy rail.
Thanks for that.
I'm going to come back to the room for questions. Any hands for folks I haven't heard from yet? Yes, into the back row to my right. Thank you.
Yeah, so I had one, obviously Blue Loop is the best, as everyone is saying. But yeah, one question about funding. I know some other metro systems have used value capture. That is, real estate in the area of a new metro station goes up something like 30%. That increase in value dwarfs, the amount that you're spending on the metro project. So are there any ideas or plans for being able to capture some of that value, which otherwise would just go to landlords?
That is an idea that I know has percolated around the halls at Metro for a while. In fact, we did a study. I don't remember if it was internal or like consultant driven. At the moment, we don't have any sort of value capture mechanism at Metro. All of the economic impacts of development around our stations, if it's on our property, we do joint development and we do get benefits from that. If it's off of our property, then it's tax revenue to the jurisdictions, and it's value, property value to the landlords. We don't capture any of that. So I love the idea, and I think Metro would be really well served by continuing to think about that and develop it. But of course, you know, that also requires buy-in from our jurisdictional partners, as they are our board of directors. They have representation on our board of directors. But it's a really interesting idea that has proven successful in a lot of other regions and for a lot of other systems. I think one thing there, though, we also want to tie that with a TOD. I mentioned before we would want to tie it to a TOD and economic development strategy for the corridor. And I think you need to find a way to generate value and capture that value while also trying to tamp down or constrain gentrification. So it's a complicated dance, but I think we should do all those things.
From our written note card, how much operational flexibility will be built into the new plans? For example, will there be connecting tracks to different lines at Roslyn, like a spur off the blue line that connects to the orange and silver lines?
Yeah, our concept has been in all of these to provide connections to maximize flexibility to route trains where you need them, even if that connection might not be a part of a revenue service. But obviously, if you're spending this kinds of dollars to build this, you're going to build it with a lot of those kinds of connections in and storage tracks where you can get them to make this service operate, you know, as best we can and most efficiently as we can. And we have assumed those kinds of connections in the very early conceptual design that we've been doing as part of this.
From Zoom, since transit is such a key part of our future, what steps might Metro take to help this project keep advancing, even if complications or funding challenges arise? Thanks for your work on making our region a better place.
You're welcome. I do think internally we have support from our executives to continue this past the selection of the LPA into project development and NEPA. In fact, in our capital budget, we've actually reserved some money to do that work. I'll be completely honest though, Metro can only do so much in terms of moving a really large, expensive project further and further through the federal process without buy-in and support from our jurisdictional partners. Because again, remember I mentioned that to get past project development into design and engineering, we have to have funding commitments for the local match at some percentage. So if we can't get that political willpower, if we can't get that buy-in, then the project really can't move forward because we need federal funding for it. So we can keep working on the PD, the project development environmental review, but that's about as much as we can do absent actual funding support.
I'm going to come back to the room. I'm checking for any hands for anyone who has not had a chance to ask a question yet before I go back to folks who've already asked a question. Going once, going twice. Okay. End of the back row here.
So I wanted to mention about like long-term plans for the system. Will any of these like alternatives have any sort of like provisions built into them? Like for example, I know there's been for a while now talk about a potential line down Columbia Pike. I know there's provisions for that at Pentagon, but the way that that's set up now, that have to be a branch of like the yellow or blue lines. So is there like any, like for example, for option alternative 4, would there be like any sort of like thought at least of like putting some sort of provision for like a second Pentagon station to be built so that that line could operate like independently of the rest of the network?
So during project development and environmental review, we have some flexibility to look at iterations or minor realignments and different station locations within an LPA, right? So if it's alternative 4, if it's the blue line loop, we can look at, okay, well, this is the core idea. What if we move it for this, on this segment, on this section, what if we move it over to this street or like this part, this corridor, or if we build this second station here, like those are changes that we can address and investigate at that time. I also think, as I mentioned before, that there's a clear need for us to look at more comprehensively. I mean, us at Metro, not us in the study, but us at Metro to look more comprehensively at the entire system and look for opportunities like that and start having, start building up planning work on that.
All right, I'm going to take a question from Zoom, and just a reminder, if anyone is on the phone, particularly if you joined late, you can ask a question by raising your hand, and we can bring you off mute. Again, if you're on the phone, dial *9 to raise your hand, *6 to unmute once you're prompted. From Zoom, is there a proposed metro location planned for the National View location? I'm not sure if that's National View or National Harbor, which is a future project that is in the works for Forest Heights, Oxon Hill area.
I have to admit I'm not aware of National View or that development, but kind of consistent with the answer I just gave, if that emerges as a development magnet for Prince George's County, we can look at that as an additional station location in the future.
And I think at this early level, we're basically just identifying general locations. And as this project, if it advances into more detailed design over time, then you start to look at precisely where these stations might fit. But right now, we're just saying in a general area where those are located.
All right, from the audience, last row in the black and blue polo.
So loops in transit systems increase delays throughout the whole day as delays from one line add up as the line keeps going around. There's not a train at the end to relieve it if it's late. So while I think that many of the extensions from the Blue Line into Maryland and National Harbor are definitely needed, I think they'd be better served by a spur of an existing line, such as going from King Street to National Harbor and then into DC. And then a question, Silver Line value capture worked on real estate values rather than land values, which disincentivizes building high COTS buildings near the transit, higher rises that can incentivize more transit-oriented development. So would future value capture work based on land values?
So I'm going to take the first comment as advisory, and I hope you had a note card that you can put somewhere so we can keep track of that. The second one is, again, we don't actually have, Metro doesn't have any value capture mechanisms right now. So whether it would be real estate or land, I mean, that's a future decision if Metro and our partners can agree on that in the first place.
From Zoom, agreeing with all who say the Blue Loop is the best alternative, what can I do as a regular citizen to help raise support for the Blue Loop?
I think definitely submitting the comments here and submitting the answers on the survey, because our board of directors and our partners really do look at those results from the survey and take them seriously. But in addition, I would say absolutely communicate your interest and your preference to your elected official. I think those, it probably won't surprise anybody in the room, but those are going to be like the single most impactful voices, I think, when this comes time for a decision. So yeah, let them know what you feel, what you think.
I'm going to come back to the room if there's any in-person questions. Otherwise, I'll go back to Zoom, and we will be wrapping up Q&A in the next 5 minutes.
Yeah, so you touched on gentrification a couple times. Obviously, that's like a really integral part of any metro extension, that people that have lived in the neighborhood for decades are going to be priced out. So what accommodations are you looking for that, whether it's affordable housing projects or rent controls?
Well, so keep in mind that Metro doesn't have any of that authority on our own. Like we can and we do affordable housing with our own joint development projects, but that would need to be some sort of mechanism. And I think it's important to distinguish between gentrification and displacement, right? So like we need and we hope that if we have new alignments, new stations, that new development would happen around those stations. What we don't want is displacing existing and current residents. So I know there's mechanisms that have been done by, like Chicago has an equitable TOD strategy. A lot of other locations have looked at this, but that would need to be the thing. We would work with our jurisdictional partners at city and county to come up with that economic development and TOD strategy, but that kind of mechanism has to come from them. Metro, we have no authority over land use decisions or taxing decisions or anything like that. So we would try to come up with a joint strategy.
From Zoom, how will the proposed alternatives interact with any ongoing maintenance and improvements? For example, if alternative 4, which is awesome, gets pushed forward, could we also work on something like having Metro open later? If we need more ridership, having the Metro open to accommodate nightlife traffic seems like a no-brainer.
Things like service and state of good repair and our service span our board of directors makes those decisions every year. So I think if there's interest, if there's advocacy for something like that, then again, keep telling write to Metro, write emails to us. We have ways to contact us and talk to your elected officials. But those decisions don't have to wait for something like a Blue Line loop, right? Like service span is something we can do at any time.
I'm checking for any questions in the room. Hand up right here in the front.
I keep hearing that word gentrification a lot with metros and metro stations, as if Metro has something to do with that. And I know you've said you don't. Obviously, you don't. I would only say, I think some of that happens because we've sort of centralized metros in certain spots that everyone tries to get to, and so that drives up sort of the value of places, which then gets back to alternatives like 4, which makes that so important. When we can spread some of that wealth out, we don't get people rushing to certain places that drive up prices and then drive people out. And so while Metro doesn't impact that, I just think for anyone in the room who's talked about gentrification, it makes alternative 4 all the more important to push because it spreads out the wealth and the benefits of Metro stations, quite frankly.
Thanks for the comment.
From Zoom, will the Blue Loop run trains going in both directions, similar to the Yamanote line in Tokyo?
It would.
Last call for in-person questions. I've got one more Zoom comment I'll read before we wrap up. Yep, hand in the last row.
So my main question about the, mainly it's the proposals to, for both the blue and the silver line alternatives to Greenbelt, considering that there's like already a rail line that goes from Union Station to through that area, which is the Mark Camden line runs on, I know. Why, and it goes through like Riverdale, so why wouldn't the, and Highsville, so why wouldn't the, why do none of those proposals consider using space next to or adjacent to that alignment like they've done for the red line and I think the blue line down by like near Alexandria?
You're bringing a lot of interesting ideas to this meeting. I appreciate it. I think we just kind of generally assume, since that those lines are owned by state of Maryland or Amtrak, depending on the line, that we would kind of like stay off of their property. But that is the kind of iteration that we can look at during project development and environmental review. If one of the alternatives going to Greenbelt is chosen, then we could look, I guess, the potential and see how willing the state of Maryland and the federal government would be to have us operate right next to the commuter rail.
Yeah, especially if that has less impacts than maybe another alignment. So that's part of the whole environmental process, is still looking at alternatives and variations on this to sort of maximize efficiency and minimize any negative impacts. So I think that would be part of it.
Of course, if you completely parallel, you don't really get new station, right? Like new station impacts or ridership, but there might be some.
And the last is, I will read as a comment to close us out from Zoom. We need alternative 4 for National Harbor, Oxon Hill, and Fort Washington. This is going to be your biggest strength. And that is it for our Q&A period.
Well, again,
Thanks.
we appreciate all the comments, all the questions, and really coming out here on a Saturday or being online on a Saturday.
Or on the phone.
So I'm going to ask the gentleman to come off stage. I'm going to wrap us up really quickly. All right, thank you again, everyone, for your attendance and participation this morning. On behalf of WMATA, we truly appreciate and value your feedback and look forward to sharing updates on this process with you in the coming weeks. A few closeout items before I let you go on your merry way today. Please be sure to provide your feedback by responding to the online survey, which is open until September 30th. You can find the survey and additional information about the study and the alternatives at wamata.com/BOS Study, and you should see the link on screen as well. In-person attendees are also invited to take the survey now on a tablet or scan the QR code to take the survey later. There is also one final public meeting related to this process that will be held on Tuesday, September 12th at Metro's LaFont Plaza headquarters in the boardroom. Thank you again for coming out on a Saturday. We really appreciate your time and have a great weekend.